Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Nick Morton from Sapphire Balconies. I'm the brand director, and it's my privilege to facilitate this panel discussion with a number of people across various different aspects of the construction industry. And we're going to be talking about BSR Gateway 2 with the question of, has the reality met expectations 1 year in? So firstly, I'd like to just start by thanking the panelists for joining us here today. We're going to go through a brief introduction. Start with you, Mark, as to who you are and what your role is.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Mark Humphreys, Director at Airy Miller. Airy Miller Group, 3 companies, one of them being Airy Miller Surveys, which I co-head. And we have within that company fire engineers, architects, principal designer, building regs, and project managers really focusing on safety, compliance, and asset management.
Eugene?
Eugene Korch. I am the leader for facade-related courses in Institute for Architectural Science and Technology. We teach facade engineering, and we assist our course participants and qualification candidates past the completion of the courses with their submissions and design work.
Paul Bussey, H&M Architects, been an RA member for some 40 years, part of the Fire Expert panel, and principal designer lead in both organisations. Thank you.
I'm David Brooke from Hawkins Brown Architects. We're a large architectural practice. We do quite a lot of HRB nature work. We've got 1 application. We've probably got 6 more lining up in terms of healthcare and residential schemes that we push through, and we're largely taking on the new principal designer duties as we have done with the senior duties.
I'm Adrian Rolls from Knockmetal. We're a subcontractor in the specialist cladding area. We work predominantly on HRBs in London, the South East, and we've become very passionate about how the Tier 2s can assist the Tier 1s and or the consultants with achieving safe buildings.
Tim Galloway, I'm a Deputy Director in the Health and Safety Executive Building Safety Regulator.
So thank you very much. And the conversation today, we're going to focus on new build residential in the context of Gateway 2 applications. And we'll obviously touch on some points which may relate to other stages or competency, but we're going to focus the conversation in that because there's so much to discuss. As we go through, we will be taking live questions from the audience. It's good to see a number have come in already. If you haven't already worked out, there's a QR code on the screen which you should be able to see. Otherwise, you can go to the website www.sli.do and using the code ATWG, Alpha Tango Whiskey Golf. And by doing so, you should be able to ask questions which we'll put in at the right time during the conversation. So we're going to explore a few areas, but I think the first thing is we've got a question about how well things have happened during the first year. So let's start with talking about what's the verdict on how well things are matching the expectations. And perhaps, Tim, if we could start off with a bit of kind of the expectations ahead of the process starting and where you feel things are working or not working in that process.
I think it would be fair to say, and I've been saying in public for some time, that when the service started and as it developed, the assumptions we had made, and every new service, both private and public sector, is based on assumptions, they turned out not to be the reality. There were a larger number of particular types of application than we expected. We were hit by the failure of a particular approved inspector or registered building control approver. That meant there were 54 cases of buildings that were actually in flight, that were in the old regime, if I can call it that suddenly became part of the new regime. And you can imagine the complexity of a building that's suddenly dropped into a different way of approaching things. And we took action because we were starting to see a backlog of some 375 cases. And we took action to seek to address that backlog, but we made a conscious decision that actually we would have to address that differently to new cases that came in. 90% of that backlog is now cleared, and 75% of material that's subsequent to July is within either the service level agreement or an agreed extension. But there are still struggles around capacity, the time taken to establish a multidisciplinary team, and that we acknowledge is eating into the time that it takes us to make assessments. On the other side, I would make two comments, and these may be slightly controversial, so forgive me. One would be, there may have been expectations among some parts of industry that nothing really would change. And that begs the question as to why you do all of that. Nothing really change, why do you have a new regime? The second would be, I think more than one player believed somehow that the whole regime would emerge fully formed. And I've said before, and people listening may have heard me say this before, if we roll back in our minds and imagine if social media existed in 1975 when the Health and Safety at Work Act came in, imagine what that social media would have been saying around concepts of what Section 3 required of so far as is reasonably practicable, and what did that mean if you were a television broadcaster, for instance, first time you've been exposed to this legislation. I doubt it would have been very complimentary. Here we are 50 years later with concepts that took, in some cases, 3 decades to settle. And nobody would be saying, well, that should emerge fully formed. So I do wonder whether some of the expectations that every I would be dotted and every T crossed were themselves realistic.
So you raise a few points there, which will hopefully come through each one of those and unpack those as we go through the conversation. Just for clarity, the point you mentioned about the backlog you've caught up on, you're talking about the projects from the company which went down, or as a broad spectrum, not just new build, are you?
Not just those, it was cases that landed with us before July of 2024. 375. Some of those we would acknowledge took a long time. Some of them took a long time because we were making requests for information, and that takes time in of itself. And I have to say, some of those requests for information were not fulfilled. They were half fulfilled, and multiple 5+ requests. And still, some of those projects failed to actually demonstrate that the building regs would be met. And in some cases, quite fundamental ways. So, whilst people do quote and say, I've had a project with BSR, it's been 11 months, I've had a project with BSR, it's been 60 this or 25 that, whatever, one might want to think about why and how much of that is, as we have been honest, genuine delays and difficulties that we had with our service, with our capacity, with the ability to draw entities, and how much of that relates to whether people were really demonstrating compliance with the regulations in such a way that we could sign that project off and give approval.
We'd like to take
fine.
next.
I take all of your points there, and I think everyone is aware of the struggles that the regulator has had with resourcing. I wonder though if you're making life a little bit more difficult for yourselves than it needs to be. And the reason I say that is because if we take another one of the government industries, Homes England, and I'll draw a parallel here to what was new legislation at the time when external wall fire risk assessments, for example, became what we were doing, EWS1 forms at the time. The industry responded, everyone came up with their own idea of what external wall assessment was. And Homes England, I think, realised quite quickly if they were going to regulate this in order to facilitate giving funding based on someone's opinion, they had to standardise that process. And they consulted with industry, and we were fortunate enough to be one of those consulted along with a number of our peers, and PAS was born. Now, I'm not saying PAS is perfect by any stretch of the imagination, it's not. But what it has meant is that Homes England have managed to review a standardised presentation of information quickly. And I think the CSS funding has been one of the success stories of what has been a very difficult time for the industry in terms of building safety. Do you think the regulator could follow suit by standardising the way a Gateway 2 submission or any submission to you is formatted? Because I think at the moment this is new, and the industry we're all responding with our own interpretation of what we think you want. And I understand there has been feedback, but I think because you're under-resourced, and I'm assuming because you're under-resourced, the feedback hasn't necessarily been as consistent as would be the most helpful. And again, that's not a criticism at all. I completely understand why that is. But if we standardise the way it was presented to you, surely that would make an under-resourced team a lot more successful in the short term.
And it has been suggested to us before, and these are not your words, but forgive me if I use it. Why don't you have a template?
Yeah.
One of the things that we're trying to achieve, and I say we in the roundest sense, not just the regulator, is that there is a cultural shift within industry. And that there's a move from trying to get it past the regulator, and I'm sure nobody in this room would be of that mindset, but some people are, to I need to assure myself that I'm meeting the building regulations. Prove to myself that I'm achieving that. Oh, no, send it to the regulator. And templates, advantageous as they are to standardise, can drive behaviour. But if it's not one template, I don't need to think about it. And for a large number of buildings, maybe that would be helpful. But the concern we would have is that as soon as we start to standardise the way the information is presented, do we start to standardise the way that the building is thought about? And then that leads us to a point where all I have to do is what it says on the template, and thus I get it past the regulator. What we are doing, I'll give way after this if I may, is working with industry, for example, through the Construction Leadership Council, with a view to industry itself starting to help itself to understand what good enough what looks like, how to present that information. To me, it's quite key that that comes from industry for two reasons. Firstly, it's then not a regulator-driven process. And secondly, it will be better. And I've said this openly before. I can write guidance. We recently produced some more guidance on the process, but it's regulators' guidance, and it has to speak to everybody. When the person wanting to do their bathroom replacement through to the tier one, what, in my view, industry will do is they will write better material because it will be spoken in the language of tier one or the language of a tier two, understanding the processes and how it all fits together. I don't, and I could never do that. That's not my field professionally. So yes, those kinds of things will be helpful, but I would not want them to drive behaviour and lead to that mentality of how do I get this past the regulator, which I think Grenfell report shows was and exists still for some people.
I do agree with that point. I don't think that, as you say, it should drive behaviour. But one of the main issues, the feedback we had from one of your colleagues, I think about this time last year, was that we were just dumping information on you, and it wasn't in the way that it was to be presented, and it's not your obligation to go searching through information presented to find the relevant points. We have to point the regulator in the right directions. And I would say, if a template were to be introduced, it wouldn't necessarily drive the narrative of what's in that submission, but how it's presented to you, so that you can find the relevant information that you need that is relevant to that building. So I don't think there should be, you need to have this, this, and this, but whatever is relevant to this building needs to be presented to us in this way, so that we can quite quickly have an informed position on this. Because currently, and this is the state that we are currently at in terms of what we're advising our clients, our programs have got a 40-week period for a Gateway 2 application. That's currently what we are experiencing across the industry. And that's not, an industry position, that's our position. And the effect it's having, the real effect it's having on us at the moment and our peers is a commercial one. We can't afford for projects to be delayed that long because I can't afford to have project managers sitting there waiting for the project to start. And the other issue that I'm really concerned about, which fortunately hasn't been an issue to us yet, is when we go onto site, the change control process, because there will be variations when a project goes into contract. We're not perfect. We aren't going to come up with all the risks pre-contract. That's just, that isn't possible, especially where we're working on existing buildings. So that where there's variations post-contract and suddenly there's prelims involved and the contractor is already on site, who bears the responsibility for those delays in terms of cost? And I'm concerned that if we're already experiencing delays pre-contract, how quickly will those variations? And that's not a question, because that's not fair to ask you that question, but I'm just saying that's something we're highlighting as a major risk to us at the moment.
I can talk a little bit about change processes, but I'm aware that it'll just be a conversation between.
No, yeah, I know. I'm sorry, I've hogged it.
I'm going to zoom out a little bit.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about what people's experiences are during the past year. In brief, perhaps Adrian, if you could give us a brief summary of your experience, we'll work down the line, just literally just 20 seconds about what you're finding generally in the applications you've been part of.
Yes, well, I think the most frustrating thing that we find is that this whole process is intended to shift behaviours, and I know that a process takes time to implement, but the behaviours haven't shifted as much as we hoped. It's clear that the intention of the legislation and the policy intention of the government is was to bring the programme to the left, to bring design early, and we're, apart from in some instances, not seeing that as we expected it to. And further to that, we're not seeing the development of the procurement processes and the commercial risk application that we expected would happen. So there's quite a lot of uncertainty at the beginning of the process. And just to give a little example of that is where in our area, it's typical that the contractors, the architects and other consultants want tier twos to contribute to the design development. And is that done under contract? Is that done as an extension of the PCSA? And then how does that continue through the process if the procurement is still predominantly after the main contract has been signed?
David?
Okay, so we've got our first application in. We're awaiting determination. It has been a little bit delayed owing to the sort of the complexities of the regime. But I think that one of the big challenges we're seeing is that cultural shift. We're quite aware of what the new regime is. We frequently read them all. Paul and I wrote the course for the ROVA to try and educate architects on what the new regime is about. So we've been looking at this very carefully. And there are certainly individuals who don't want to understand the realities of what's being asked for us. And there are those attempts to try and game the system or see what we can get away with, which is not what we share. But also when we're more the one voice telling that against the entire design team or clients and funders, they're often not really wanting to hear this. So that is sometimes causing difficulties in our relationships, and it is putting big pressures on projects and procurements. And an example I sometimes give is that, if we have everything absolutely perfectly compliant, it would sort of be as-built information. But we know as designers, we work through the entire construction program, continually designing. And I just checked on some of my projects, the total number of documents at the end of that project will be between 10,000 and 30,000. Nobody wants to be given 10,000 documents to check. So the challenge is whilst it's very clear that we need change control plans, mandatory occurrence reporting, I think the question is sort of what is the appropriate level of detail? And I think even when we have some level of certainty as what is a reasonable level of detail to show compliance, that's a challenging threshold to judge because everybody will have a different opinion. And from the applicants, where we have spoken to the BRPDs who have got their schemes approved and sort of Dycates and Square and Beeston, Labour and Broadway Main, they were sort of saying that their experiences are actually quite different and sort of what information was challenged. So I think it is that challenge, I think, of needing to get some certainty, and hopefully with some schemes approved, that may set a precedent. So far, we're collating rejection notices as best as we can to understand why schemes are being rejected, because that is an indication of how we can set a minimum threshold that these elements should be evidenced. We're often recommending that anyway, but we're at least piecing that together to try and put a picture together of what should a reasonable application look like in terms of level of detail, bridging that design sort of design intent, showing enough to demonstrate compliance, but not necessarily having every subcontractor appointed that we have that sort of, thousands upon thousands of documents there evidence the full design. And I think that's the sort of knife edge that we're trying to navigate at the moment, and hopefully we'll find out soon in terms of our application coming to the test.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, without repeating what David's talked about, the RIBA would produce this tracker, which is actually a massively narrative, very complicated and probably incomprehensible type of document. It's not dissimilar to the risk registers that have emanated from CDM and cause more confusion than they have sorting things out and actually creating this illusion of safety. So we sort of developed with the Cognac Construction Industry Advisory Committee a design risk management toolkit, which initially started off with CDM issues, and it alludes towards this the standard document that Mark was referring to earlier, that actually captures things in one place, is comprehensible to the regulator and the team and the young junior architects who are usually responsible for filling these in. But it's not just a tick box template. You've got to use your intelligence and understanding of how projects develop and put them together into what we're calling strategic design sufficiency level of information, which can provide the regulator with what they need as a starting point. Because at the end of the day, they're not approvers, although they're called approvers. They're actually verifiers. I think I'm happy to have that discussion later. But they're not actually approving anything here. They're just verifying that what the team are doing makes sense. So if we can get that balance correctly put together in a comprehensible way, I think we can move on. Thank you.
Eugene?
From our vantage point, from Facade's perspective, what we see is there's two parts of the industry. One is that basically is unhappy with the new regime, and there's a second one that is finding it incredibly profitable. We don't hear about them. They exist. They keep it quiet and very busy and making quite a lot of money in the background. So what we find they're doing is that, and they find it's really good that there's no template. They create their own. So they create their own template. I'm just sharing the success stories. I think it's a great shift in the industry. What they're doing is they're creating a list of documents that a building would have to be prepared for, the list of documents that have to be prepared for a building throughout design life, from beginning of concept design to very completion. They do as much as possible and submit some form of narrative, either within documents or executive summary, of why something wasn't done yet, why it's not possible, and how the risk that may associate with these items is managed. And they're fairly confident that they're going to get approvals, and there are some approvals coming back. So they create their own document. It gives a lot of freedom to the designer. There's no template. So you can create your own and convince the other party to that this is the template that everyone needs to follow, or this particular project needs to follow. So the communication is an issue. Exactly, the problem would stem from, like, if you dump a lot of documentation on the Building Safety Regulator, they will have to look for it. I mean, for the right things. You have to be really good at demonstrating that. So creating your own template and following it and trying to convince the other side that this is a template to follow is good. And the shift in industry is great. I think within 2 years, the industry is completely changed. I welcome these changes. Effectively, what government have done is basically all the clients and architects and contractors are businesses, and they would see the risks and the projects for a financial perspective first, because that's what they will see first. So safety became secondary. What government did just basically link the two. So you now basically pay a lot of attention to safety because it becomes a financial risk to you, and this is great. I think that this change is very welcome, and I think it's actually going quite well for certain people. And obviously we knew that there would be some people for whom it's not going to go well. And this is the point.
Interesting points you raise there. And Mark?
I think Eugene had some interesting points there. I think it has changed the industry. It's a massive culture shock to the industry. I think there are still issues around the level of understanding of that change. Principal designer building regs is a prime example of that. I don't think many of our clients or much of the industry actually understands what that role is and how to properly implement that role at the moment. I think that's something we're going to have to work through. But if there are practices or businesses within the industry that are getting it right, it's important that we share that information. Ultimately, we have to collaborate as an industry to move forward. The way the industry has changed, the way, we've now got pre-construction service agreements, the whole concept of design and dump is now starting to fade to the background. Thank God people are understanding they need to work collaboratively. Well, our industry has to do that. If you understand that you've got a commercial advantage if you get it and you are submitting and it's going through quickly, but we need to learn together because ultimately we have quotas as an industry to hit. And if the majority of us are failing, well, then everyone ultimately will fail.
Yeah, certainly we've shared some of the other experiences people have had with being involved in 14 gone in. Some of those have been approved. We're seeing, like Eugene was talking, really kind of a lot of good proactive activity. Some great companies which are doing a lot of proactive things, Rates, Formedix, and amongst others. There are still some deers in the headlights. Companies which are perhaps hoping that the regime isn't going to change much, and we're certainly seeing some activities which set themselves up to a re-tendering process after the Gateway 2, which fundamentally seems like a backward step towards what Hackett identified at the start. But I want to talk about information that's come up a few times, the detailed level of information and so on. And Paul, you made an interesting comment to me the other day when we were talking about it, about the kind of being an impasse, if you like, where there's so much information to create, so much information given to BSR that's drowning, and linking that impasse. How do we actually solve that? And Tim, I'd be interested in your opinion. This is an assumption we're making that the information is overwhelming in many of the applications and so on, but I'd be interested in your input as to, firstly, is that a correct assumption? And secondly, what do we do about this impasse?
Well, I like the phrase design and dump because I think, unfortunately, that's what some organisations are doing. And that generates two issues. One is almost the idea it's in there somewhere. And if you're presenting to me that kind of perspective, the question that goes through my mind is, if you're telling me that I have to go looking for it, how have you found it? How have you assured yourself if it's somewhere in 10 to 30,000 documents? The second is, we do have to go through it, and it is a cost recovery regime. So every minute that a registered building inspector from one of the local authorities or contracted providers from the private sector, every minute that a fire and rescue service fire inspector or fire engineer is looking through that material, there is a meter that is going tick, tick, tick. And what we are finding is that of those X thousand documents, about 10% are actually relevant to the question of, does this design, will it lead to a building that will comply with the building regulations?
Why? What is it about that 10%?
They enable us to see the means by which the organisation is saying there is a standard, for example, in relation to the prevention of fire. We believe that that is the right standard to apply, and that will help us achieve the functional requirements of the regulations. This is how we have achieved that standard, and here is where you can find the evidence. I was looking at one earlier today. one that we have looked at, and we want to check. We don't want to start talking about we'll do it this way kind of thing. But it's set out, it's a remediation of cladding. It talks about who has made the decision that the building is capable of taking the weight of the new cladding. Why they think that, what evidence they base that opinion on. They have the original drawings. It tells them what the building was capable of taking. They know the product, and that is set out as well, and who's commissioned that product. And they know how much that weighs, effectively. And they've said, I know from that historical data what the building is capable of taking. I know the specification of this product. And you put the two together, so I can assure you that I've assured myself that that building can take the weight of that cladding. And it's set out in a table. And you can track it, you can see as a regular, you follow your argument. And that's one of the things, I can follow your argument, how you have critically appraised it and assured yourself. And note, that one happens to be a table. It could be a narrative, it could be something else, it could be a mime, but it enables us to follow your reasoning and to find then, look here, look at that plan, look at that document, and look there. And there you will see the evidence that I am saying as an applicant underpins my assurance to myself and thus my assurance to you, to the registered building inspector that you're working with, to the fire and rescue service personnel, to the structural engineer, the acoustic engineer, because let's not forget the building regulations are wider than just what would be regarded as fire and structure. I set it out for you. I walk you through my thought processes. And unfortunately, some people are not in that place. We are aware that of two things here, I would also say. One is that there has been the suggestion, and I think it's a reasonable one, that we, BSR, have not been consistent. And I've had it said, two designs, more or less the same, but we get very different requests for information. We are working with registered building inspectors, we're working with the same people who were doing this before, and they are coming at things from their professional opinion. And so it doesn't surprise me in these early days that people are going, where we want to get to, and work that we will do, is to start to set out from a BSR perspective, this is what we expect. One of the ones we want to do is the detail and expectations of CFD. So that you don't end up with people going, well, hang on a minute, I was asked for stamp detail, now I'm being asked over here for 10,000 documents just on the CFD. We want to narrow that so there is a BSR position. And we want to continue to work with the industry such that the industry is setting out, this is design sufficient, this is the level of detail that is appropriate to assure yourself. You can assure yourself you've got a better chance of assuring the regulator. And just pondering a moment on that, what people have said about the kind of thing that was described, where you submit tender, you get through your gateway 2, and you start changing it, you start the change control process questions. That kind of design sufficiency and what gets past the regulator, that is almost a focus on, in an end-to-end process from, why don't we build a building like that, to who people can go and live in it now. Everybody is zoning in on that one moment there, called Gateway 2. And what, as one of the earlier speakers said, is the mentality shift is this end. And Gateway 2 is almost an inconvenience. Yes, because I've done my work, I'm sure. If I'm sure, I'm not damn sure. And then we'll get it all done. If the industry got to that point, I think the objectives of the regime would be achieved. What everybody in this room and everybody listening is probably would be a great deal happier. And we get better buildings.
So just trying to summarise that a little bit.
Yeah, sorry, I went on for too long. Bad habit, forgive me.
It's like an old exam for basically saying, show your workings, right? So you're saying, here's the answer, but this is why the answer is that. And making it really simple so it's easy to map all the way through and signpost it back to the information. Not just on the life safety, although that's obviously the priority of most of the conversations around it, but I think you're talking a wider remit of every aspect of buildings, are you?
Building regulations have no primacy, sorry. I know of buildings where it's clear the acoustic standards weren't met. Imagine living in a house or a flat where you can hear everything your neighbour does, and the mental health impacts of that. Ventilation standards. Imagine living with black mould and what happens to that poor boy as a consequence. Overheating. Imagine living in a flat where during the summer you are roasting and during the winter you are freezing. Those aspects. Imagine living in a flat where you are in digital poverty because people haven't thought about how digital services will function in that building. So you cannot work from home and you have to pay the costs of commuting. Not an option that's open to you. So these other aspects are important because, and forgive me for this caricature, there is, in my view, little point having a building that will not fall down and will not catch fire, but when you flush the toilet, it always backs up. So, yes, the focus has been on life safety, quite naturally, but to me, building is a system. It serves a number of functions, a social good, an economic good, a safety good, and if all we're doing is narrowing in on that bit, one of those aspects, then we're leading to a built environment that cannot serve some of the functions that society wants it to serve. And that, to me, would be an opportunity lost. And if you're not putting in the thought up front before Gateway to think about, well, how do I make sure the drains function, then that's almost as bad as not thinking about how do I make sure that the smoke will get pulled back into the evacuation routes, which is a real example of the Gateway 2 application. Their own CFD showed that smoke from a fire in an apartment would be pulled into the evacuation routes by their design. It's all got to be there.
It's a good point you raised, because I think there's probably a general assumption across the industry that the priority and the focus and the projections are all about fire safety or structural safety. But Paul, what do you think on this kind of impasse you mentioned?
Well, yeah, I mean, we've got an impasse at the moment, pretty much, and we're trying to unlock that, and certainly that's very much the intention of getting the toolkit put together. And the toolkit needs to be implemented by professionals. It's not just a template and fill in. So people with all the experience of the things that Tim has just been referring to are crucial. It includes the working out, the maths equation, how do we get to that answer, and that's got to be integral with it. But it's got to be an executive summary to that. The idea of it being as concise and succinct as possible, and that there will be other things which will need to come on further down the line, perhaps less critical, but equally important, and to actually help the regulator and the client, everybody, to see the whole picture. I've got to say, when we were trained as architects, we have to know a little about a lot of things. That is the nature of our training. You don't have to be an expert in structure or fire or anything, but we do need to compile it all together. And I think that's what is being expected of us as architectural PDs. I know there's various other building regs PDs who think they've just got to produce a big spreadsheet in Excel and they've answered the question. I don't think that does it. There might be a bit of that in the background, but I think somehow we've got to get all this information and control it in a manageable way, because I think people are just overwhelmed by too much information at the moment.
So how do we get that balance right as well with the toolkit? There's always a temptation for that to become almost a commoditized way of doing things, and then it just is about kind of repeating that, copy and pasting it from the previous one or using those. But there's also some good principles with a lot of those toolkits and so on, which would benefit project after project. How do you get that balance
So it's got to be a strategic level of information that relates to the design of that project and understanding the complexity of that project. And it can also relate right down to a small domestic project. You've still got many of the sectors or the parts of the building regs to prove, but we're concentrating on elements rather than the parts of the building regs. That seems to be the wrong starting point, as much as that's in the background. So, for example, you start off with substructure, you then move on to the superstructure, then the roof, and then the staircases, the balconies, whatever, and you actually consider those in relation to all parts of the building regs. And bringing it together in that format, we then say fire stopping of that is something that there's 1,000 different service penetrations in this building. We're not going to have all that information at this stage. We're going to give you a sufficiently explored proposal as to how we're going to deliver those 1,000 penetrations at a later stage to an agreed program with the regulator. It breaks it down into manageable chunks. We're just overwhelmed by too much. And that is the point of the toolkit. It's not a template. So it's not just fill in here and you can't copy and paste, but you can use strategic drawings from other consultants. Again, that's what, as an architect, we had to do as what we call our part 2, where we were designing a major building. We had to break it down as just an architectural student, understand all the components of that building, but not design it in detail.
Yeah.
So I think that we're trained in that respect, David, are we not?
Yeah, I think so. It's that challenging balance of sort of, the focus is structure and fire, but clearly you have to comply with every aspect of building regulations. That's always been the case. We do see clients turn around who should know better go, well, we're just going to derogate this. You can't fundamentally derogate the building regulations. You might be able to derogate an aspect of guidance, statutory guidance in approved documents or a British standard, because of the complexity and nature of buildings. Guidance does not fit the case perfectly. It's not like every building matches things perfectly. So there's always a scope of interpretation. We always have to make sure we're hitting those requirements. And I think the really hard balance is then, a bit of the architect is working out as how we manage the delivery and design of buildings, is understanding what's important at the right time. And that's why we have the RIBA plan of work. And the whole procurement industry is sort of revolved around us balancing those risks, because we have to make sure things are buildable and coordinated so they can be delivered. But as our application, we just realised we've probably got some upstands that are off. But now we're reviewing that, going, well, that's actually a major change control because we're changing something, an external wall. It's part of the structural design principle. It's very negligible. We're changing it to be more compliant. But I've got clients and consultants worried that, well, maybe we should build it wrong until we've submitted that major change application and got approval. And that seems completely unintuitive, to be purposefully building something that was incorrect but probably might be approved, and then having to go back and change it, when really we're talking about changing that to 100 mil. But the law in the change control procedures just says changing any structural design or principles or any change in the external wall, which is extremely onerous. So there is a concern of, well, someone going to be playing spot the difference on our drawings and saying, well, you've changed the structural design there. Sometimes that uptime design is really negligible. Sometimes there could be an increased complexity of how that's performing in terms of like punch and shear or that upstands there, maybe support masonry lanes. So it's very, very complex sometimes of, is that something that could just be said, well, we've changed the design, but it's not the approved design anymore, there's a risk there, or is it actually, well, we as competent designers know this is not meaningful change, it's not having any meaningful impact to compliance, so therefore can we change that? And that's like a really tricky navigation in terms of the threshold of the requirements of the major change control, I think.
This is where proportionality is into the whole discussion, I think.
Yeah, I think we know what that should be, but we've also got a duty to advise our clients to say, well, we think we might have a series of major change. We've identified through the gateway determination process, so this is even before we've got an approval, we've identified that an upstand was missed, or some levels are out, a slab level was changed late in the design, didn't get picked up in the coordination model. It should have done, comments were made to that, but it wasn't finally checked. In theory, we should have had more time to check it, but that wasn't the case. So now we know, well, actually, we've got the principal slab level incorrect. It's not significantly going to change anything. We're quite happy with how that would, but clearly we're going to have to submit that through the process to make sure it's discharged so that information is accurate at the time when it comes to building.
So on remediation projects, we're going to have to do this because we're going to find things which we didn't expect when we start refurbishing. And that, to go through the gateway again, is ludicrous. So we need to have that process in train somehow.
I think this is a really key point, because we use the expression change control at a micro level, because you get a situation where there's a building tolerance issue, perhaps as you mentioned, a slab level, or perhaps even just the formwork is slightly That then immediately knocks on to which active fire stopping am I going to use? And so, and that might change because the error is only in a certain elevation or a certain area. And we've got to be able to have a process that is able to respond to that level of change control, which is not, it's been caused by an error, but it's not a malicious error. It's not even an oversight. And it's kind of, it's been dealt with quite efficiently in the past by people who know what they're doing, have been able to say, this doesn't work, so we can do this achieves the objectives. Now, if we've got a 6-week block, and we've gone past Gateway 2, but if the design isn't complete, right down to the kind of the smallest level before Gateway 2, we're building in change control issues, and then we've got to manage the building tolerance issues as they go through.
Got to comment on this. So,
I think there's a couple of remarks that I'd make, and I don't know that this will necessarily satisfy the points that have been made, but things that are rolling through my mind are that one of the elements of the processes that you will have in place is your change control procedure. And there will be changes that are foreseeable and changes that are not as foreseeable. So the point as was made, you come up against issues. And one that's been mentioned, for example, is pilot. You assume that there's a certain structure ground beneath, and then you find that there's a disused tunnel over a river. Nobody knew that was there. If you have given thought to your change control processes and you anticipate that that might happen, how are you going to manage that change process? How are you going to do that redesign? How are you going to assure yourself that your new plan for laying out that pilot is still achieving that structural integrity? How are you then going to control that changing process? What's going to happen at the site to make sure that the new arrangements are put in place? Everybody knows the size, the depth, the nature of it, etc. If you're into that territory, you may be able to say, well, actually, that's a notifiable change, because I have this really well-structured process that leads me to a point where that anticipated thing, because it happens everywhere, doesn't it? I'm managing it. It's more difficult, I think, when you're into a situation where it was supposed to be 190 millimeters and somebody's only built it 150. Because you didn't anticipate that. And people normally don't make floors 40 millimeters thinner than they should have been, whatever it happens to be. And that may be where you do end up in the more, sorry, that is structural, it is a major change, and it does need to go through the process, the mini gateway too. And for our part, we have to see that the law is met, and we then would have to say that is a major change, and you will have to stop, because those things that we defined as major changes, we defined as major changes for good reason. Whereas in some other cases, if your change control plan, if your construction control plan is sufficiently robust, you may be in a position where you can actually say that's a notifiable change, and I'm managing that change. So if you intended to use product A, but when it comes to the actual construction, product A is not available in the amount that you intended, so you go to product B, but product B and product A have the same specification, it's notifiable. But if somebody values engineers product A out and puts in product B has gone from category A fire performance to category B, that clearly is something that's rather different.
One of the points which, when David mentioned, I think he mentioned break reports or major reports, something in there, if it's facade related, isn't it every change is a major change? And how does that kind of work with the Building Safety Act's wording around, obviously facades have got a different approach to other parts of a building. In a support system like that, would you have to go back in and not be able to work on anything? This seems like there's quite a lot of knock-on consequences and that uncertainty at the moment because of so few projects having been approved from a new build point of view. 7 was the last number I heard. Is there not a lot of uncertainty currently about how that might then impact what you were talking about earlier?
That was going to be my question. When you say stop the works, do you mean that element of the works or the works in their entirety?
Yes.
Okay.
Forgive me.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Good. Because that worried me a little bit.
I'm not expecting everybody to just
Down tools.
I mean,
yeah.
there may be changes. That's how so fundamentally the effective.
No, of course, like foundation changes, and yeah, you can't go on. But change control has been something that has been prevalent in our industry since I started in it. And robust change control processes are key to a success of any project. Not only from a compliance perspective in terms of what the client gets at the end of the project, but also from a financial perspective in terms of, what the final account looks like. And forgive me, that's my world. That is also what I'm interested in, is what does it cost at the end. But so I think the change control procedures should already be in place and quite robustly. What we've never had to do is stop that element of the works after the client has approved it and after our design teams have approved it to say, okay, we're happy that meets the employer's requirements, we're happy that meets, who say that we have to meet the functional requirements of building regulations, we've approved that to go ahead. It's that next phase on that says we've now got to submit it again. Just as I say, from a commercial perspective, that is a concern because there will be what it means from our. I'd be interested to see how the lawyers deal with this in contract amendments going forward in terms of who picks up the financial risk of that delay. And I think there's going to be a lot of arguments about what you could have done in terms of works around. Do you know what I mean? And it's going to open up a whole world of contractual issues. And I think there's a lot of work to be done in the industry to agree who is going to bear it's going to be a shared responsibility, because I guarantee the next contracts that will be drafted, the client will be putting it on the contractor will be putting it on the client. There are going to be massive discussions and arguments about who takes on that risk, because it is such a significant financial risk in terms of the prelim costs of delay, and that's the overarching view we need to take of this. I completely agree with you. We're shooting for the greatest standard. We should be, but I think there has to be a practical view on this as well, in terms of, okay, you're doing this. If they stop works, it's going to cost you 200 grand a week in prelims for us to review this on top of your cost to review this. We understand the premise of what you're trying to achieve here. Get on with it. The details can follow, but you take responsibility for satisfying us. But you're professionals. You know what you have to do to satisfy us, but we won't hold up the works. But you have an obligation to make sure that we're happy with it. And if you're not happy with it, you take it back down, which is what we'd have to do anyway if we didn't satisfy building regulations.
Who gets to call the difference between a notifiable and a major change?
Very clearly documented in the briefs.
It is set out in the legislation.
Yes, but without being disrespectful, I think your comment a few minutes ago actually kind of blur that slightly, because you're saying you might be able to say that it's notifiable if you've thought it through properly.
I use that as an example.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not wanting to
because
criticize.
we have had that one mentioned, and we will work these things through. We are all working within the immigration. Let's not forget.
Yeah.
And no, it didn't emerge fully formed on April 28th, 2022. I hope it doesn't take 36 years to resolve in the way that some of the elements of health and safety legislation did. And I am absolutely sure that my colleague there is correct. Some of this will create an entire new commercial set of arrangements and an entirely new set of lawyers arguing cases in the court, not around building regs compliance, but around who should shoulder the cost of the fact that there was a major change and that delayed things. As a regulator, I have to look at the elements that are around compliance with the building regulations. And the law, as it stands, drives us in certain directions.
Mm-hmm.
It may be that over time, some of the questions that you have posed and the impacts of that legislation lead to a review that leads to changes in legislation, in the same way that all legislation is periodically put through that test and modified.
I think the point I was just trying to make is we have to have a holistic approach to this. And I completely agree that approach should be driven by safety and the residents who will ultimately occupy that building. But there also has to be an understanding of the commercial implications of what we're doing. And that, ultimately, I know money is a dirty word, but developers, consultants, we're not charities. We have to make money. And if we're not, we won't be in business and buildings won't get constructed. So I think that these discussions around who takes responsibility have to run concurrently now with the discussions around how we implement this going forward, because I think it will have quite a big practical implication on how that happens, especially around the change control. And I would welcome the opportunity to discuss that with your colleagues in the same sort of forum that we're doing, and with you as well, to work with industry to say, okay, there are elements of this where we can't odds it. You are going to have to, but we will work with you to facilitate works happening as quickly as they can, to mitigate any delay on site and the cost that will impose ultimately on the clients and the end users, really, which is what it will come down to. But that's just a point I wanted to get across.
On top of that, the other commercial aspect of it is that you've got a lot of manufacturers, their key resources, the design time and the expertise they have. A lot of that is happening now in PCSA agreements, which are much smaller value, maybe 10% of what might have been the value they would have got during the design process previously. Also, a lot of it's speculative. Adrian, we were talking before we started this panel discussion that there's a bunch of applications which are going in, and some of those will never be built. Might be because they're rejected and that they can't get it to stack up financially. Might just be it's got nice. Might be it's lost funding. And these are all real impacts for a company which has got their most precious resource tied up for less money than it previously used to be, but also on building which are now, and I think the common new build process, people are talking about 40 weeks, is generally kind of being talked about as kind of projects going in that process for 40 weeks. Whether it's 40, whether it's 20, whether it's 50, it's a big period of time. And there's a massive potential gap where people are putting more resources up front for less money. They're tying up a lot of those key resources, but some of it's actually speculative. And the company which you're going to get is the company which is the cheapest person post-tender. I'd be interested to know kind of how these considerations are actually being fed back in and considered by BSR in the kind of overall process, because what we don't want to do is be knocking out all of the key people which have tied up good resources because they're competent companies, and then gets raised to the bottom again, and the companies which have gone and the companies which invested a good amount of time up front, the best in the industry, and we've actually ended up lowering the bar in competency overall. How are these considerations been taken into consideration, Tim?
Can I just add a point to that? The availability and cost of PI insurance and the continuity of PI insurance cover is all part of that discussion.
Yeah.
Because I think we're going to see PI providers reassessing their risk, reassessing the cost of that risk, and that could have a major drag on the ability to provide competent advice to the industry.
There are elements of what you've said that are not areas that the BSR can comment on. I recognise that there are organisations out there who are now being asked to do more for upfront design, and yet the payment terms they're facing as to when they will receive that payment haven't changed. So effectively, they're front-end loading their costs, but the same point in the contract is when their money comes in. I would only be able to express a personal view on how the construction industry is operating in the relationship between contractors and various other players in the supply chain.
If you take the role of a regulator, like Ofgem or something like that, surely one of their key considerations is how it's financially impacting people more generally, or most of these regulators are looking at the big picture from a commercial aspect, how that plays out as well. Not just, I appreciate that the industries are hugely different, but there's the strategic pieces and there's also that broader kind of impact on everyone. Is that not part of the remit of the regulator?
If one talks about the likes of Ofgem, they are an economic regulator. That is part of their remit, is to look at and make sure that as an economic entity, that market is functioning.
So who plays that for
The
construction?
Building Safety Regulator, it's in the name. And in this space, we are the same as a registered building control approver or a local authority building control service in relation to mid-rise, mega warehouses, my loft conversion. So to a certain extent, we have taken on that role for a defined set of buildings. The overall health and function, if one likes, of construction as an industry, as a process, sits in places like the department, MHCLG, Ministry of Housing and Communities, Local Government, the Department for Business and Trade, the Treasury. And I apologise to listeners if it sounds like I'm being a bit slopey shoulders. I am a health and safety, a building control regulator. And so one wouldn't anticipate that your local authority who's dealing with my building control or my loft regulation is sort of responsible for the health of the construction industry in the local vicinity. These kind of issues, I don't deny exist. And speaking personally, I think it's perhaps unfortunate that some organisations are playing these financial ways. And they possibly do need to be addressed. But those are issues that perhaps need to be played out through parts of government that hold the ring there. They may need to be played out through revisions to contract structures, such that they are discouraged. And those are areas where the industry itself may need to apply pressure in order to achieve those objectives.
Do you think there's going to be a situation? Sorry, you were going to bounce it. I'll cut across.
Have to add after you.
Yeah. Do you think there's going to be a situation? Obviously, the government, as it stands now, have put across some quite large housing targets that have got to be met by our industry. You've mentioned obviously MHCLG. Do you anticipate a situation where there might be sort of pressure from MHCLG onto the HSE to facilitate buildings to move quicker if the industry is bleating? And I understand that a lot of the feedback probably isn't necessarily fair because it's down to misunderstanding of the situation, and I think there is a bit of a vicious circle there of misinformation and probably not great feedback. I mean, people come up with their own conclusions. But do you anticipate, because as Nick has said, 7 new build high-rise residential HRBs approved, we're probably already way off the targets we were given in terms of what we have to deliver from a housing perspective. And I understand a lot of the housing we deliver isn't HRBs, it's low-rise residential. But do you anticipate pressure in the future to sort of facilitate that and not be perceived as the industry as maybe a blocker in that scenario? And that's not fair, I understand that, but that is a perception.
I think it would be fair to say that pressure, though not quite in the way you described, and I'll come back to that in a moment, has been present certainly since the early part of 2024. And that pressure we've responded to. we've recruited, we've driven efficiencies within our own processes as far as we can. Our average turnaround time on category A's major works is currently 18.8 weeks. It is an average, so I've no doubt there are 40 ones in there. On category B's, it's about 10. But we continue to work on piloting different approaches, driving further efficiencies, and continue to work in the industry. Just this week was making suggestions as to how we might work in a different way in order to increase the efficiency and speed with which we turn around projects that are demonstrating compliance. And I, from my own personal perspective, would want us to get to a point where if your project makes the argument, demonstrates, etc., you go through at pace. But if it doesn't, you will find yourself being sent out. Because the time that we are spending on those projects that aren't meeting the standard and all these to and fro, and you've only sent us out the information, is all time that we're not spending on those compliant ones. And that's almost a disincentive, if you see what I mean. If your project compliant, it should come through. There's no desire on the part of the Deputy Prime Minister or the Minister for Housing to have 1.5 million homes that don't meet the building regulations. Because as the DPM, if I recall, said, the intent is for 1.5 million safe, quality homes. And I would hope that no part of the industry would place pressure on MHCLG, Building Safety Regulator, the Department for Business and Trade, or any other part of government to ignore those standards in order to get to a number of 1.5 million.
No.
Because that serves nobody any good. We saw how that played out, and I don't know that anybody.
No, I think the industry has learned its lesson there. It's bearing the brunt of the cost for its mistakes. The developer mediation contracts, the industry is bearing the brunt of that cost. I don't think any contractor or developer that we're currently working with is flippant about its obligations going forward. I just think we need a cohesive approach to it that works for everyone to achieve what we need to in terms of what the best standard is, but in a way that's practical. Sorry, Paul.
No, that's great. Good to discuss that. Could I suggest a mention of contractual changes, which I couldn't agree more with, that we've been through a design and build process for some 30, 40 years. And is that really the best way? So design then build seems to be a much better way forward, but qualified by unless unforeseeable events occur, which I think is what you're alluding to.
Yeah.
Really. So we need to get the lawyers to actually sort that out, I think, but also get this level of proportionality to take our next point, that these specialty subcontractors aren't going to do a full design up front. They're going to give a strategic design of how they're going to design that at an appropriate stage, which is very much what's intended by this toolkit methodology. So trying to capture both sides of the equation here.
Thanks, Paul. I'm going to move the conversation on. We've had quite a few questions, so I want to just run through some of these a bit rapid fire as we're going to kind of straight, if you like. The first one sort of relates to the point you were just making there about sort of mindset and activity, but probably one for you, or specifically to you, Tim. Why are manufacturers with poor safety track records still being used for Gateway 2 application design? What are the BSR going to do about it?
I think, first of all, in terms of manufacturers and their products, the government has brought forward a green paper on construction products, and our colleagues in MHCLG continue to work. We have a national products regulator, construction products regulator, and our colleagues in Office of Product Safety Standards. We work with them, we have a good relationship with them. Are their products meeting the standards? If their products are meeting the standards and people are using products that are fit for purpose, and the people who are installing those products are competent and understand how to use them and want to use them properly, then the safety record of the organisation does one have that as a feature at Gateway too? Should I turn around and go, oh, supplier X, they're very, very poor, therefore, the fact that you're going to use supplier X means that immediately you're rejected? No, my question is, as you showed yourself, are you going to meet the building regulations, etc.? The question perhaps for the market in some cases is, well, are you comfortable with those suppliers? Have you, from your perspective, done the due diligence that assures yourself that that supplier, that manufacturer is providing the product with the consistency of manufacturing standards, etc.? That means that when you put that product in there, you're actually getting something that is aerated, and that over time it hasn't ended up something not aerated. The other thing that does occur, of course, is that the Prime Minister was quite clear that there are certain organisations that government, as a client, has taken, will take a decision not to use as a client for work where the government is a client, and equally the private sector can make similar decisions for itself. But I don't know that we as building control body turn around and go, because you're using them, your gateway to application is immediately struck down.
Taking that question, it mentioned about a track record. So the Building Safety Act obviously requires competent people to be the skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours. Track record perhaps infers experience and behaviours haven't been there. But that should be the process of every principal designer, every principal contractor, looking at the skills, knowledge, expertise, experience, and behaviours of everyone who's in that process. So that should be caught, if I'm understanding your response there correctly. So that should be part of that process of somebody satisfying themselves from a principal design, principal contractor point of view. David, you're...
I was going to say, well, the designer should satisfy themselves.
Yeah.
The principal designer can't have every level of expertise for every product. I think fundamentally it misunderstands the testing environments that are they really suitable, because large passive fire protection providers in terms of plasterboard, the test standards basically say, they don't test double doors in walls. We put double doors in walls. Someone can now challenge that. And then you can go, well, isn't it reasonable? How can I extrapolate that? So we now have to give consideration. And you could always take that to a level where you could find something that hasn't been tested.
Yeah.
I spoke to one of those key suppliers yesterday. They've only once tested a timber mattress in a wall once. They've never tested it with the kitchen on. Is that wall going to perform for 60 minutes with the kitchen on? Probably not. It's going to fall and deflect. So there is a huge challenge in terms of navigating, even with the most reputable suppliers, as to then what's reasonable. And with the challenges that are being produced, we see a hardening of that, where now our response to us as designers specifying those products, trying to do the best we can, get told we don't have test data for that. And then we end up in a very difficult situation, then having to take all reasonable steps, assess everything else in the market, see what's reasonable, see what challenges, are there any anecdotal tests, do we need to appoint a third-party fire engineer under passive fire protection forum rules to assess this, to scrutinise it, even for quite simple day-to-day things that we build, that I would reasonably say that, well, I don't think there is a precedent of risk in that, but there isn't strictly test data to support my justifications in that. It's just sort of what I've learned. So it's a challenging situation, and actually I think we are seeing a hardening of the advice that we get from suppliers, and we are finding that all these testing arrangements aren't necessarily fit for purpose. Walls were only ever tested at 3 metres and were allowed to be extended up to 4.9 metres. That's now come down into new test standards. But even very basic things, I think those fundamental requirements are now really being challenged as to whether those testing criteria are suitable, which we're all working to try and plug the gaps of, but it adds an extra level of uncertainty and risk in terms of what is demonstrably compliant in our assumptions that we're specifying.
But this is something that's picked up in the Grenfell report, wasn't it, that test data needs to be clearer. And unfortunately, I think it sort of pushes for a super regulator as well, who sort of oversees everything, which I don't think we're ready for at all yet, or anyone, or the industry is ready for. But completely agree that test data is confusing and contradicts itself.
Comb through this stuff, even lift suppliers were sort of challenging to say, well, can we fire stop your lift thresholds? And this is a major UK supplier, and they can't really give us a very clear answer. So we are having to ring the bell and say, look, principal designer come to the table, we are concerned about compliance compatibility is. And their sort of assumption is, well, this is how we always did it. So we're having to go to sort of very in-depth discussions just to understand the testing arrangements. I mean, even a combustibility test relies on 4 separate subtests. People go, it's class B, it's fine. That test only lasts 10 minutes. Is that an indication of the performance of how someone's going to be performing 30 minutes to 60 minutes?
Yeah.
And I'm lucky that I'm in a large organisation that I can scrutinise these tests and read these reports that aren't written to be explained. They're written for testing houses to comply with. And we have to unpick these things to go, well, actually, do we anything that's reasonable? Because if I've got some timber paneling, well, it might mean that it's going to perform all right for the first 10 minutes, but then after 10 minutes, it could become quite dangerous. So we have to start taking those steps, but even the guidance and the testing regimes don't necessarily come back. It comes back to sort of Paul's point, to sort of trying to be proportional about what we're trying to achieve at the end of time. You need to focus on those, those broad principles of actually, are we making it safe? But in doing so, I think then it is that point. We do have to quite meticulously go through as a system and check these things very, very carefully to slightly standardise things, to work with more reputable supply chains and manufacturers that we know we are going to do the right thing.
Also got another question about accountability for the BSR. Who holds the BSR to account, and in terms of making commitments and actually making sure they're moving forward towards them?
We have a regular monthly meeting with Mr. Housing. As part of that, we are held to account by him. The Deputy Prime Minister also has given us attention and is holding us to account against what she expects is the role of the BSR and what BSR has been put there to achieve. My colleagues in the department hold me personally and my peers to account every month on the basis of an assurance forum, and there is a subset of the HC board that also provides advice to us. We are subject to, as all government departments, to the internal audit processes within government. Indeed, we have, within the last 3 months, been audited on certain aspects of our performance, and there was a report about how well we are doing. We are scrutinised. It would be fair to say in a 34-year career, have never been subject to the degree of scrutiny that myself, my colleagues, and the organisation, part of the organisation that I'm in, is being subjected to now. And of course, you will all recognise that as an industry, you are scrutinising us. And that may be where some of the misinformation is being generated. I heard about a project where it took 11 months, and therefore all projects take 11 months, whether or not that is actually the case. And some of that scrutiny is entirely appropriate and it is fair, and the criticisms that emerge from it are well made. Some of it is not.
What would your response be to, there's obviously there's very few projects being rejected, but there's a lot of information of applications and the quality of content which has come through. What is the BSR doing about feeding that back into the industry?
Certainly the work that we're doing with the Construction Leadership Council is key here. There's a regular task and finish group that meets weekly. My team are part of that. We are contributing to the development of materials by the industry with a view to getting further information out, recycling, as I put it, the lessons that we have learned. One of the things that we are actively working on, indeed we've been challenged and are seeking to step up to that challenge, is can you help us understand what good enough looks like? What we're finding is that there isn't an application where you go, yes, but we've seen a part of an application here. Look, these are really good building regs compliance statements. This is a really good competence statement. Here are 2 examples of really good construction control plans, and being able then to work with the Construction Leadership Council to try and distill out elements that move us forward, with a view to then having, as we've had for many, many years, indeed recognised in the occupational health and safety sphere, a standard that both industry and the regulator are signed up to and say, right, that's the benchmark. We all know that is what adequate looks like. That's what good enough is. And that's an active project that we are engaged in and will doubtless continue to be engaged in for many years to come, because it's not as if all of this will emerge in manuals and it's complete suite of materials and everything is done. Finally, Mark, we recently produced more updated, I should say, our guidance on gov.uk about the building control process. That responded to research with, I think, around 50 people or organisations who've been through the process about what they found difficult to navigate. And we took that information and we rewrote our guidance to respond to those difficulties, to try and help people and organisations navigate better. It doesn't fit the tier 1s or the tier 2s because it is from the people doing the bathroom up to that level, but it does respond to lessons learned through that active research.
Okay. And one of the other questions sort of relating to this, we have sort of touched on it a little bit, but can we have clear guidelines around what can and can't be changed after a Gateway 2 submission and what different categories of change are? Have you got any other comments other than that's quite spelled out obviously in the Building Safety Act, but any other comments about guidance and any clarity on that?
Those are the kind of areas where we would look forward to working with different players to try and achieve that. I'm sure it's going to be one of the things that once the work that we're doing currently with the CLC is complete, we'll move on to other aspects of that. I think one of the things that we have to recognise here, though, is that unfortunately some of this, as we found with health and safety, is going to end up in decided cases. It is going to require, either in the commercial sense or the criminal sense, cases to go to court and to end up in the Supreme Court eventually, and the justices would say the interpretation is this. As they did with Sapphire Balconies, as they did with foreseeable, as they did in Mailer versus Austin Rover in 1989 on Section 4 of the Health and Safety Work Act, those things will emerge. And that will take a little bit of time. And in the interim, we will all have to work together to try and agree those standards and those positions. But there will need to be some decided cases to illustrate some of these new concepts. And until that happens, there will always be this element where one is trying to find one's way through. And what I would want us all to do, industry and regulator, and as necessary, is to work together to try and define that. But do I have an answer? Have I written it? Probably not. Not right now.
Separate topic, separate question. As a subcontractor advising on specialist bespoke products for residential buildings, how do we advise time-poor, unconfident contractors and what they need to achieve to pass?
Interesting, and the questioner will forgive me, but picking up on that word, to pass. First of all, look at the guidance on gov.uk. Second, upfront design. Third, assure yourself that you're meeting the building regulations. And for that particular subcontractor, what's your role in that process? It sounds as if there's an element of design going into that. So you have designer duties. Are you satisfying your designer duties? Are you providing the information to that time-poor contractor that enables them to assure themselves that your product is going to enable them to meet the building regulations? And that may be the key thing that you as a designer need to do, is to actually help them understand how your product is helping them achieve that objective of meeting building regulations.
May I redirect this question slightly and change it? Upfront design and bespoke, these two words. On that thing, I would like to redirect it to David and Paul. Do you see a change in the design from the architectural perspective? What you do at planning stage, are you trying to avoid bespoke now? Or how does actually Building Safety Act and this Gateway submission affects your designs?
We've massively changed a lot of our processes. We've sort of pre-vetted 70 types of construction, sort of roofs and floors with pre-selected components that our technical team have pre-validated the compliance. So when we're specifying the sheathing board, we're not just saying it's one sheathing board. we've looked at a dozen sheathing boards and we've picked it for that specific reason because we're happy with the pull-out load, the combustibility, its compatibility with cavity barriers, because that is sort of work that we think we can't really do on the fly as successfully. And to take those changes, we are doing a lot more of that work up front to try and partner with our supply chain, going back to things like sort of, the Nathan report. We want to work with the good people who we know have the right cultures and leadership and take the values. We know they do the work properly, and we want to try our hardest to protect that design for which we're responsible for. And we are finding ourselves getting very robust. If someone says, well, we don't want to do that, we're saying, look, we're the responsible designer. You can't change our design. That's our job to do and make sure we do it right. And historically, people have been very good at saying, oh, we can't do that in planning. We need to be much better at just saying, we can't do that because it's non-compliant. And someone else can challenge us on that. And if someone really wants to put something towards us, we should go, look, give us your cost-benefit analysis. Rather than just changing it for something that might save £10,000, it might cost us a few £1,000s even just to scrutinise that change. And we know that's where compliance gets unpicked because things become incompatible because they weren't scrutinised. So we're trying much, much harder to say, look, this is what we've designed, it's appropriate. We're willing to take it, but we have to then recognise that might delay applications, it's going to take us longer, and we can't just continually reselect products. We want to see that being more firmly selected and contractors being in that mindset. We need to work with a view to delivering compliance and trying to afford some flexibility in that because we need to give clients better value. But that needs to be managed very carefully pre-application to make sure that they've been selected appropriately. Now, of course, post-application, we've got to part through the high-risk building procedures, which means they are meticulously controlled in terms of any change control. So I think that is the way we're trying to see it in terms of sort of overall design. We are absolutely working to try and comply with everything from the outset because it's so much easier. Even something like a high contrast nosing, sometimes that might be said, oh, is that really relevant, something that's about access? But someone else might come out and say, well, maybe that's needed for firefighters to help them navigate a smoke-filled stair. So we are largely saying, well, we should just design every nosing to be 55 mils on length. And if not, we should be providing some justification to say why we really selected and why we know that's reasonable. So we are trying to cover off all those bases to say that we have tried to address almost every recommendation as clearly as we can to avoid the need for the extra justification of that process.
Do you feel you're competent to design to a kind of stage 5, or stage 5 level on bespoke products?
I think that's the challenge in getting the engagement, and for us, we're trying to recommend so much more engagement with specialist subcontractors and designers to get them in earlier. And this is the problem with the funding mechanisms revolved around, but we are trying to say, well, if we know we're largely going to be using someone like Sapphire Balconies, which is an excellent product, why don't we just appoint them before the contractor's involved to get that design work? Why can't they just be a specialist part of the design team and changing that sort of culture that where we know those elements can impact structural design and lead to lots of major change control risk? Why don't we just get them involved and say, look, it's sort of frowned upon in D&B having named dominated contractors, but we know it's compliant. So why don't we get the masonry support design and we get the balcony design, and we know we've de-risked a huge amount of facades. And if it comes to it, it's too costly, then we know we can go through that. It's much more friction for that process because at least we've got a coordinated design in the first place. So I think that's where we want to lean into, that actually almost we are bringing subcontractor design almost away from the contractor perhaps, looking at perhaps whether we should just start to push these things early. And that is a challenge to the way design and build's working, but we think it'd probably be quite valuable to try to do that. It's just the funding is the difficulty of having that extra allowance for those fees.
So it's great to hear that. Effectively going back to what we did in the 80s, having named subcontractors on traditional contracts. It made sense, but unfortunately design and build completely changed all that world. We've got to rechange our processes.
Do you perceive that the PCSA process could be adapted to incorporate that?
I think that's already what we're proposing, that we are trying to insist that we think these are critical aspects of subcontractor design that impact compliance, and we are suggesting that we think we need this in full, so full masonry support design. If we've got curtain walling, that's got things to do with wind loading, ground protection, so many of those. There are aspects we might say internal balustrading. We probably don't need the full design, but maybe we'd like a small package of that to say that we've got an example post, we've got the well designed, but it's not necessarily done in every instance. So trying to provide a flavour of all those seating packages that we think are lower risk, but where we know it's going to be needed for building straight away, providing all that information up front, and that would be the most robust way.
Design sufficiency.
Yes, exactly.
Great. So, and David, it's great to hear that, and Paul, that kind of approach has been taken with the most critical piece on that. I'm conscious that we're almost at the end of our allotted time. I'm going to ask each of you for a key takeaway in a second. but I'm going to let it overrun slightly because we've got a few other questions I'd like to put to Tim, if that's okay, Tim. The first of which is, this is regarding warranty providers. They hold a lot of power and influence, but tend to disregard the regulations. Is there any regulation for warranty providers? So that's the question. Interesting input on that.
In terms of the legislation that exists, that BSR enforces, I don't know that there is any leverage that I have over warranty providers. I think warranty providers, before the Building Safety Act, there were some questions posed about some of them, and there may be other levers that the market or the parts of government may need to think about in terms of how warranty providers execute their functions.
Another one here, thanks for that response, Tim. Any regulator is planning to issue, are the regulators planning to issue more Gateway 2 consents with conditions? Surely 80% of the applications contain the information needed to start a substructural frame.
The idea of approval with requirements, as it's now called, to be a bit of a pedant, exists, and applicants are free to suggest that here's our Gateway 2 application. These are areas that actually we would design in more detail later. And the registered building inspector, the multidisciplinary team, the building safety regulator can come to a view as to, well, is the design sufficiency at this point to say Gateway 2 approval, and as a colleague said earlier, with the timeline as to when that more detailed design will emerge, because it may be the stairs, it may be the plumbing, it may be the ventilation system, whatever it happens to be, that no, you can't have it absolutely signed, sealed down to the last moment now. What I have been told, though, is that approval with conditions in the past was sometimes used, shall we say, for elements that really should have been thought about earlier. And one of the things, interesting, the remarks about earlier involvement in the design process. One of the things that we introduced in 2021 was Planning Gateway 1, which came in for a great deal of criticism, but it achieved, I would argue, the introduction of fire design and fire design professionals at a much earlier stage, rather than here's my design, make that fire safe, which was where things were. And to me, it is not necessarily a bad thing if critical designs are thought out and people who are involved in designing those are brought in. So it is a holistic thing, rather than I've done my design, you design me a safe structural support for masonry. You know, you scratch out the word fire and put in something else. But there are elements of design we would accept that are not in that place and perhaps are more around approval with requirements. There's also then staged approvals or staged applications. And what we're wanting to get over, what the new approach got us away from, I would say, is that, right, our first stage is flat 1, our second stage is flat 2, our third stage is flat 3. So rather, my first stage is the podium, my second stage is building 1, my third stage is building 2, and so on and so forth. But each of those visual stages, I will do the design for, such that it will go through that gateway process. And equally as well, the kind of idea as to approaches of partial approvals. I want to occupy the commercial part of this building first. And that's agreed in advance. That is what I am planning towards. Then I will do the residential bit second, and so on and so forth, rather than I want to occupy flat 1 or flat 2, and so on. So move us into a much more planned, structured approach that makes sure that the actual building, that when it's being used, is fit for purpose, it's fit and safe for people who are using all of it.
A little bit of a confusing question. I think it's mixing up what Building Safety Act and BSR are, but I think the gist of the question, Tim, is how do you get advisory support from the BSR?
We are, and indeed our material as it stands online, providing support on the process of application. We are not sitting down with you and going, well, I've made that 120 millimetres rather than 90. And if one reads and I know this is a cause of some concern in the industry, but if one reads the Grenfell Phase 2 report, it makes absolutely clear that the line between building control as service provider and building control as regulator was crossed, and it was crossed into service provision rather than regulation. In the Grenfell report, the panel was very, very clear that actually needed to shift back. In our view, and it is our view as a building control body, the building control bodies may take a different approach. Our view is that it's appropriate for us to help through the design process and to work with industry to help people through the design process. We are not comfortable as an organisation with active involvement in design. And there are questions that are being posed to us about whether that's right, and those questions will play out. But as things stand, it's around for us. We will help you understand how to get through this process, but we're not going to sit down with you and determine whether the masonry is sufficiently well supported. That is your role. It is your building. You are the duty role.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to wrap up now with a takeaway from each person on the panel here. Tim, if you could perhaps start off with what your key takeaway would be for the audience.
I think it is assure yourself that you are meeting the requirements of the building regulations. If you assure yourself, you will find it a great deal easier to assure the Building Safety Regulator and the things with which it works. And that for me would be the key thing that will move this forward.
Adrian?
I'm going to go away and talk to our design team about adding narrative to our designs, because I think there's a lot of narrative goes into it. We don't write it down, so show your own homework.
I think from our perspective, I think we sort of refresh ourselves on how we behave. That we're always very quick to hide fault and blame, and we need to just be much more transparent and open. People will make mistakes. We need to realise that we do and address them and solve them collaboratively and come together to ensure that we are sort of holding those objectives of ensuring compliance, not saying, well, actually, this is all too hard. Can we bury it? Can we brush it aside? Or hope they'll ask that question, and that actually will need to sort of enshrine that principle of getting compliance and work together to achieve that openly and collaboratively, and not hiding behind it.
So I'd like to work with Tim and his team in the CLC Building Safety Regulator Task and Finish Group, which I'm a member, to try and get sort of better agreement on design sufficiency and actually really bottom that out, together with what actually is approval with requirements in a bit more detail scale. And that they're certainly on the agenda. We're trying to get strategic design perhaps at Gateway 2 and a detailed design at Gateway 2 a bit later. Gateway 2A and 2B was suggested in a meeting yesterday. Thank you.
My takeaway is that it appears to be that everyone has to be really good at communicating the design, get better at it. The designs probably will be more standardized, and that is driven by everyone within the industry and architects, also architects. And I think it's a great opportunity for competent people within the industry.
I think from my takeaway is that we're all, as an industry, extremely focused on the technical aspects of delivering to the BSR. I think we can't lose sight of the practical aspects of what we're doing as well. And I welcome the idea of approval with further submissions. I think we have to be able to facilitate the industry to build at the pace required, but also meet its obligations to build buildings in line with what we are requirements going forward. Thank you. And from my point of view, I think the
show you your workings and mark it out clearly, signposting to people where it is a critical part of the role of every part contributing to BSR applications. I'd like to thank all the panel. Thank you also for the many questions we've had and for those who have filled out the poll. It's quite interesting. Be interested if the panel have got any opinions on the poll. If you haven't found the poll in the Slido app, there's a separate tab where you can put how familiar you are with the BSR Gateway 2. But it does seem that there is certainly an aspect of familiarity across those who have completed that. But thank you very much for your input, everyone online. We will be continuing the conversation, but moving to the competency aspect of it on the 4th of June at 10 to 11:30. If you'd like to sign up for that, there should be a code coming up shortly on the screen. Otherwise, you can go to the Resi Build website, www.resi.build, and sign up there for that conversation. But certainly, we'd like to thank the panelists and thank everyone for their contributions today. Thanks and goodbye from us.